welcome out there to the Switch for Good podcast. I am Dotsie Bausch, and I am here with my amazing co-host, Alexandra Paul. And we have a really cool special guest in studio. But before that, I think everyone's going to want to hear about this weekend and you speaking at the environmental conference in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I went to Washington, D.C., which was fun because it was the height of the cherry blossoms. So my husband, Ian, came also for a few days. And then I spoke at this conference at George Washington University on human overpopulation, which, as you know, is an issue. You've heard me speak. You're so sweet. You came and supported me.
She's so good.
When I spoke last year. And human overpopulation is an issue that about which I am incredibly concerned. So it was a terrific forum. Most of the time, there aren't forums about human overpopulation.
Right.
Generally, because it's an issue that people are just afraid to talk about. They feel like it's going to offend them and take away their rights and all that, and it's actually none of that. And who was there was Louis
Fasoyos,
who directed you in Game Changers.
He's
also filming a documentary about overpopulation, and he also directed your commercial, anti-dairy commercial.
That's right, how we all got started at Switch for Good.
So it's a small world, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I was just going to mention that about it's something that people shy away from because human overpopulation is obviously kind of discussing maybe not having children, right? So that's, what is, when you said it's not really that at all that people need to be fearful of, what are the one or two main points that you make in your presentation or that you made this weekend at this overpopulation conference that people are surprised to hear you say and maybe can then decide to potentially get on board?
Well, first of all, because it's been for the whole existence of humans, our method of survival has been to procreate. Now it's really hard for us at 7.7 billion people on the planet to turn our mindset and go, ooh, to survive, we actually have to not procreate. So that's one of the reasons why it's so hard for people to wrap their head around the fact that, hey, you know what? Instead of having big, happy families, we need to have smaller, happy families, and that there's so many benefits to that. And one of the main points I make is that forcing people to have smaller families does not work, and it is not right, and none of us populationists advocate for that, and you can actually lower the population, the birth rate, by many incredible things like empowering women, educating girls, giving free medical care. There's so many wonderful things that actually happen to lower the birth rate. And of course, a happier life for everybody in the future generations.
Right, as we creep up towards 10 billion people on the planet.
No, the UN says that we're going to hit 11.2 billion at the end of this century. So yeah,
oh gosh.
And we're now at 7.7. And when I was born, and I'm 55, the number of people on the planet was 3 billion. So it has more than doubled in just my lifetime, which is. I've been working on this issue for 20 years, and I haven't been doing a very good job because our population keeps going up. Let's move on to our guest today and talk about another issue.
Let's do. It's fascinating, though.
Thank you,
yeah, we have another professional athlete in the house here at Switch for Good in our studio. This is Chris Manderino, and he is joining us to discuss all things NFL so that I can understand what's going on in the Super Bowl.
And me too.
We're not just going to talk about NFL. We'll talk about a lot of other things besides that, but it's a good hook. Gosh, Chris, he is quite the football prodigy. He walked on to the Berkeley football team as a freshman and started all 4 years, correct?
That's correct.
It's mind-blowing. After playing as a fullback for the Cincinnati Bengals and later the Kansas City Chiefs, he lived in Italy and played professionally for the Bologna Doves. And following his retirement, he dove into a successful career in sales, but eventually decided to pursue his own business, Lyfe Fuel, a plant-based nutrition company that helps people obtain better health by small step actions. So welcome. Thanks for making the drive down behind the orange curtain.
I have to put you to work as our copywriter. That was great. Thanks for the intro.
I may have had a little bit of help.
Yeah.
But oh man, it's really rad to have you here. We got to really first interact and hang out at the Switch for Good launch last August, our athlete summit. And thank you for being part of that. Thank you for bringing
Absolutely.
Lyfe Fuel into the Switch for Good summit. I know so many of the people that were there and so many of the athletes are fans now and purchase it, and I love it, and we're going to talk about that for sure.
Awesome.
A little bit later. But so you started, going back a bit, you started playing tackle football when you were 8.
Yep.
So just like a wee little tyke. I guess that's when most really good football players start. They start quite young.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably changing now, obviously, with I think more parents kind of being concerned about, when to start their kids, in the sport, whether to allow it or not. But for me, we didn't know, I guess, everything that we know now about brain injuries and all that stuff. So I was always, looked up to my dad. My dad played big time collegiate football. It was always my dream to kind of follow in his footsteps. And so I got started when I was really young, and I actually went through that and battled my mom a little bit. She didn't want me to play football right away because my dad had gotten pretty beat up from injuries and stuff like that. But I said, Mom, I'm playing football, and if I have to go out and earn the money to do it, I'm going to pay for it. Like, this is what I wanted to do. And so I did, and, I guess the rest is history. But, yeah, I got started very young, and it was an incredible journey, incredible experience. So,
Yeah.
Well, you obviously were a very good player, and that persistence paid off because then you went into the NFL, which a lot of your teammates did not.
right.
Yeah. So when you were there, I read something where you said you were a lot bigger, with 40 pounds bigger.
Yeah, I'm probably 205 now. Is definitely, I think, around 240 plus at my highest weight. So, and that was always a constant challenge because I redshirted my first year. I was probably about 200, 205 maybe. And then kind of one of the strength and conditioning coaches got in my ear, said, hey, coaches are taking notice. They like what you're doing, but you're going to have to put on weight. Like, you can't play at fullback in the Pac-12 or Pac-10 at that time at the weight you're at. So I was just really tasked. I mean, eating became really a full-time job, just getting enough calories. And, the amount that you're training, you're burning off so much, it's really challenging
We
to
call it force
put on
feeding.
weight and put on weight the right way. So that was
So what did you do? How did you put on this weight? Because I know that when you were, I read that when you were in the NFL, you didn't feel great.
Yeah.
And was that, well, I'm sure you're getting beat up physically, but
Right.
also
Right.
what were you eating? What were you being
Yeah, what did
encouraged
that
to
bulk
eat?
look
Yeah,
like?
I mean, really at that time, I personally didn't have the knowledge that I have now about diet, nutrition. We didn't have,
Right.
I guess people on our training staff either that really took, the interest in like dialing that in for each athlete. A lot of times it was, for the guys that had to lose weight, they'd be on a special diet, but for everybody else and somebody like me, it was just like, eat massive
Game
amounts
on.
of calories, like literally this table full of food, and you'd sit there for an hour or more just trying to get in enough calories. And it was, a lot of people would say, oh, that's a great problem to have, but, it starts to get, it's fatigues you, it's just like a full-time job trying to get enough calories in. And it really wasn't, I was always a little bit more conscious about like what I was eating, but, it was nowhere near to the way that I changed my diet after having the experience of living abroad in Italy, which really opened my eyes to, the polarity between the population there, the food there, and what I'd always kind of learned throughout what it took to be big and strong and competitive as a football player.
Which
And
was what?
that was obviously, whey protein shakes and lots of meat and dairy and all that stuff, right? And that was the most calorically dense food, right? And that was also, there's like this stigma with that, you have to be, meat really, and is what makes you big and strong, and whey protein is what makes you big and strong. And so that was always kind of what we had been sold, and
Completely.
you started to realize, and I did later when I had to continue to eat more, I just didn't feel good after I would eat. I would be fatigued, I just heartburn, gut problems, and just I think you learn to deal with a lot of that stuff just kind of as an athlete. You tough it out or whatever. It's just kind of part of what goes along with the territory. But in retrospect, you're like, geez, like had I known what I know now, had I been yeah, I could have still eaten a ton of calories, but if I would have changed the fuel source to be, much cleaner, not eat all these inflammatory foods, I mean, who knows, like how much more of a freak athlete I could have been, how, quicker the recovery probably would have been had I been putting the right fuel in my body all along.
Now, have you stayed in? This was in the mid-aughts that you were a football player.
Yeah, so '01 through '06 at Berkeley, and then '06 through '09 basically, the
Here in
NFL,
America.
and then Italy. Yeah.
So, have you been in touch with any of your friends who were football players when you were playing, and are they still eating that way, and how are they?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I just took a guy's trip to Big Sky, Montana. One of the guys was kind of coordinating everything. We had like a chef come in and all that, and they knew I had like specific requirements and all that, right? So it was
Crazy
like my
plant-based guy.
special menu and all
Right.
that. But we had really good conversations because we did some skiing, and so you're on the chairlift and stuff, and they're definitely interested because they're feeling the long-term effects of that now, right? It's manifesting in their physical appearance, in their energy levels, and just overall health and wellness. So they're definitely intrigued, but I think the biggest challenge, and the challenge I personally face, is the change in the psychology and looking at food differently. It's really, when I looked at food as fuel, right? And you can
Right.
either have high octane, high performance fuel that makes you feel more energized, that basically contributes to everything you want to get out of life, or food that slows you down, makes you lethargic, makes you inflamed, bloated, put on weight. You know, those
Yeah.
those things start to
Yeah.
catch up
Yeah.
to you the older you get, especially when you don't change those eating behaviors and habits, which is, I think, the most challenging thing to do, just because it's been ingrained in you for so long that you just are accustomed to eating a certain way. It's tough to change that habit. It
No
takes
doubt.
time.
Yeah.
So,
What was your aha journey, or maybe it was an aha moment? Everybody's different. But what had you start to look behind closed doors and peel back the layers on what you were eating and how it was actually affecting how you feel? Imagine that, right? And then potentially affecting how your body is going to be as we all age, and whether disease is going to come in or not, or what happened?
yeah, so for me, it was more of a gradual transition, a gradual process. A lot of, just N of one experimentation, trial and error, and just really looking for, and this was, 10, 15 years ago, before, the plant-based movement is what it is today. So really just trying a lot of that stuff personally, but it was really when I was living in Italy that I saw the difference between the population. You didn't see obesity the way that it is here, especially if you spend any time in the Midwest
No.
or the South. It's
Right.
pretty alarming, right? And there, and the 90-year-old grandmas are out there walking to the grocery store every day. They're getting their food. They're walking back home.
I know.
They're cooking every day. Even, when I would go to the store and get like produce or anything like that, I would notice it would perish in a pretty short amount of time. Whereas, when I was shopping here, stuff would last for like 3 weeks or a month. So it's just like,
Scratching your head on that
wait,
one.
yeah,
Wait a
something's
minute.
not right here, right? And so, and I just didn't need to be 240 plus pounds anymore. So it was really about how do I,
This was after
physically
you were playing.
transform.
You were playing with the Doves in Bologna.
Yeah, I was
or-
playing, but I was, again, playing both sides of the ball. So I wasn't playing fullback. I was
Right.
running back, and I was safety, and I was like all over the field,
Okay.
kind of like I was back in high school. And there's no way I could have done that at the weight that I was. And just, physically, I wasn't totally happy with, my body image at 240 plus pounds. And just like everything hurt, right?
Oh,
And,
really? Yeah.
I mean,
Joints and everything that moved
Was
hurt.
that
Yeah.
because of your diet, which was inflammatory, as you said, or was it because it just was too much? Was it muscle or fat on you?
So it was definitely both. It was more muscle, more fat. And I think, obviously the diet only compounded that, right? The inflammatory
When you
part
say
of it.
inflammatory, I think maybe our audience would like to know what you mean by inflammatory. Like what foods are inflammatory?
So dairy to start, obviously. I think, one thing that we have to be careful of when we talk about diet and nutrition is not to speak too broadly. Because I think where we're going is it's becoming more specific, right? A lot of times you just say, okay, meat's bad, or, certain types of food are bad, but you need to kind of look go one step further, and it's really about, okay, how is that, produced? How is it grown? How is it harvested, right? Because, let's say grain or something that's full of glyphosate and other stuff isn't any healthier than, some other types of food that might be better off, right? So there's a lot of things that can be inflammatory. And, the main ones are going to be sugar, dairy, refined oils. And so I really...
And the chemicals that they spray on them.
Exactly.
I mean, those are
all
just
the
like
pesticides
lethal.
and herbicides and everything else, right? So, it takes a lot of due diligence and going that one step further. A lot of times stuff, if it's in a package, it's already, red flags should be up, because how much do you really know about, the farmer or whatever's on the, downstream of that? And so that over time for me has been where I've continued to learn and just look to, okay, what is in our food? Because today, most of what we eat would be unrecognizable, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, right? And our food has just drastically changed so much that we have to be kind of, our own self-advocates for seeking out, what it makes us feel good. And that's, I guess, the first place to start is that intuitiveness to say, okay, when I eat this, how do I feel, right? Is it giving me more energy? Is it making me feel more alive and well? Or do I have a temporary benefit that, it tastes good, but, then I want to go take a nap, or my gut's a mess, or, something.
You look fantastic. You've been
Thank
an
you.
athlete. A lot of people will want to emulate you. So when you talk about the foods you that make you feel good and that you look for, tell us what are the criteria?
First off, I mean, really this year, it's trying to not eat stuff in a package that's not always feasible, right? And so basically when it is out of a package, first thing I'll look for is the ingredients, right? And so I think just like a basic tutorial on how to read a nutrition label is something very simple but very empowering. So, typically if it has like 5 or more ingredients, then I will avoid it. Depending on obviously what it is exactly. If it has a lot of stuff that I can't pronounce or won't recognize, then it's definitely off the list. Like a little test that I'll do with my nephew when I babysit him. He's like, he wants Doritos and Cheetos and all this stuff. It's like, cool, you can have them if you can pronounce the ingredients on the back of the package.
Perfect for the little kiddo.
And he's like,
spends
X,
all
Y,
afternoon.
and Z. They're like, those aren't supposed to be together. And like, so that's really where I stood. But 90% is really food in its natural form, right? So, talking about green veggies, all the, boring, but, the stuff that really makes you
But full of
feel
life.
good. Yeah, exactly.
I noticed when I raced a lot in Italy, and the biggest difference I feel like from here as far as food consumption goes and grocery stores and convenience stores, whatever, they always say to stay out of the aisles, right? To stay healthy,
Perimeter.
right? Stay on the
Yep.
perimeter. And they have a very large perimeter that then spills into the aisles. I mean, there's fruits and vegetables in the aisles. And we have the opposite. It's like a small perimeter and this massive, like especially if you go to a Ralph's or Albertsons or Piggly Wiggly or Winn-Dixie, I'm trying to think of some of the grocery stores that are all over the country, just ginormous section of every single thing you would hear crinkling before you opened it.
Yeah.
And that is what is considered food. And I guess really what you're saying is that's actually not food.
Right. Yeah, the majority of it's not. And I think we've just gotten so far disconnected with where our food comes from. When I was living in Italy, it was like a permanent farmer's market, and you still had like the specialist grocer. You still had your butcher, for meats. And so it wasn't like, yes, markets do exist. That wasn't where I was shopping. I was fortunate enough to be close enough to the center where that's where it was. And that's, how we used to consume food. We used to know, the person that was producing it. Unfortunately, that's not always, accessible. It's not always the reality, especially, if you look around our country, there's a lot of food deserts, right, where you just don't have access to, clean, healthy food. So it's pretty big challenge, when you're trying to do the right thing, trying to seek out clean, good food, and that's all you have, at your availability.
And with 7.7 billion people on the planet, it's a little harder to know your farmer than when there was 500 million or something.
Exactly.
I mean, that makes more sense that we would have been able to look down the street and say, hey, Joe, it's not that way anymore. I mean, most of our food doesn't even come from within our own country.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's like if you look at an apple, for instance, right? I mean, we have like beautiful orchards up in Sebastopol, not too far away, but majority of apples will travel like halfway around the world before they, ever, before you eat it, right? If it's sitting in a grocery store. And then you start to think or something, as fragile as like a blueberry or whatever, how did this blueberry make this trip all the way here and like this
not get
pristine,
crushed
like,
or something?
State? Yeah. So
right. And look at
start to make you, think. And so, obviously if you have access to a farmer's market or something like that, you can, eat more locally, that's a great step in the right direction because generally, the food that you're going to get there is, closer to home. It's going to be, you can talk to the producers of it, find out about, their farming practices or whatever it might be. Just make a more informed decision about what you're putting in your body.
So in Italy, you began to re-look at how the foods you ate instead of just looking at calories and getting more in and whey protein. You started looking more at fresh foods, local foods, and you moved away from dairy.
Yep.
You still eat meat, but you tell us about your philosophy about dairy and what happened there. Because you were drinking a lot of whey protein.
It's all that
and what did you uncover besides start? You knew you didn't feel great, but
well, yeah. So it was just always, and if you look at it, right, you have Gatorade and Power Bar and all these like big sponsors, right? And so they are smart. They get their products into the athletes' hands very, very early on, right? And so the college is kind of pushing that on you, and a lot of times that was our only meal of the day until we got to training tables. So we'd double up on the whey protein shakes and the whey power bars or whatever, and that would be our fuel to get us through until we had to go to practice. I think that's changed a little bit now, but like we were scrounging around for money, trying to like hustle where we would get their lunch from, try to take, meals home from training table just to get us through to that one big like buffet meal the next day. But it was always, it wasn't even on the radar that there was like plant-based was even an option when I was playing, right? And it was almost, I had a friend in college who, he was vegan or vegetarian, and he was like, the guys would ridicule him. He was like, oh, there's no way that you're going to be able to compete, eating that rabbit food or whatever. But then when I got to the NFL, really when I was in Kansas City, I saw Tony Gonzalez and how dialed in he was with his health and his diet, and he had his own like nutritionist. And I mean, Tony Gonzalez is like a Greek Adonis. Is like, it's like, oh wow, like that's what I should be striving to. And he wasn't, loading up with dairy or any of this other crap. And so, it was partly.
Was he a vegan or a vegetarian or just?
I don't know exactly.
Aware of his...
I think he was or is, but he was definitely very, very aware of what he was consuming. And so seeing that, and then going and living in Italy, they didn't guzzle milk the way that we do here, where it's like a part of like every single meal. And it's kind of, I think some of that's counterintuitive, right? Because you think of Italy and you always think of like pizza and all this stuff, but it's not to the extent of, it is here. And also probably the way in which, it's raised is a little bit different than it is here. But for me, I saw it as, once I started to learn the science behind it, to understand the amount of processing that whey has to go through to make it, I guess, safe for humans' consumption was pretty alarming, because really it's a byproduct of, first milk and cheese production, and then you have whey. And it was really in I think the 80s and the boom of, the big muscle building era.
So it's very, very processed is what one
it's
great
a processed
point
food.
is. Very
processed
more
food.
than just even a
And
cheese.
don't they take the casein and
Yeah.
make it highly full of casein, which is a carcinogenic?
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
Was that something that you were aware of?
Yeah. So, I mean, the more I looked into it, the more I realized that there was all these things with whey that I didn't want to consume, that I wouldn't consume, and it was tough because here I was thinking, oh, I'm making all these positive changes, and whey was kind of like one of the last things that I really thought about, just because it was always, on the front side, it's like, oh, it builds lean muscle. Like, of course it's good for me, right? I've always known it to, as I was getting bigger and stronger as an athlete, is just something I was doing. So maybe some of that I equated with whey protein.
Jerry says it's good for us. It must be.
Right, exactly.
Right there with you.
Yeah, but then when I learned more about the science about, okay, what actually builds lean muscle, how you can do that through plant-based fuel sources instead of whey, it's like, okay, it was a no-brainer. It's like, why would I take this highly processed, form of fuel when I'm trying to cut out as much processed food out of my diet to begin with, knowing that there's just all the different challenges that come along with it.
Mm-hmm. So for our listeners who want to know what a football player now substitutes for whey for his muscles and things, what do you do?
Yeah, so we have a combination of a plant-based, it's a pea and rice protein. So with those two, they're complementary amino acid profiles. So you get that whole, so basically to build lean muscle, you need the essential amino acids. And typically it's the leucine, lysine, and isoleucine that you need. And more so, there's a leucine threshold now that, I think one of the questions kind of arose at the plant-based nutrition conference that we were down at. And there's still, some science on both sides. But the
saying what?
So that you can't get into muscle protein synthesis unless you meet a certain leucine threshold. And that varies based off personal, height, weight, age, different things. It goes up as you age. So it's still kind of like newer science. I haven't gotten a real clear answer. So if you guys speak to anybody, I'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah.
But,
me too.
It's really, trying to get all the essential amino acids. And then we have to also take into consideration is the digestibility of the protein source. So a lot of times you'll see, 30 grams of whey protein. How much of that is actually digested is, a better question to answer, because that means how much your body's actually able to use to put to use for muscle building. And so the knack against, plant-based proteins has always been that they're inferior because they're incomplete protein sources, right? So one-to-one next to an animal-based source, they just don't stack up from a PDCAS standpoint or DIVA score, which is basically just how you rank a protein, basically by the amino acids that your body can actually digest. However, when you put complementary proteins together, they can equate to what you would get from an animal-based source. We're actually working on a fermented version, which is bioequivalent to a whey protein, which I'm really excited about because it just, now that whole debate goes out the window because now you're getting, 1.0 to 1.0.
So are you saying that now a plant-based protein isn't as bioavailable as a whey protein in terms of getting protein?
So as a single protein source, the knack has always been it's incomplete, just meaning that it doesn't possess all the amino acids, that essential aminos, right? Which mean you have to get them through the diet. So if you were to just take only rice protein, let's say, and that's the only source of protein you had, in theory, you'd be deficient in, certain amino acids that rice lack. However, when you combine it with pea, which is high in lysine and rice isn't, now you have more of a complete protein source. And so I've read different science, heard different theories on that, and whether it has to be at one sitting where they're combined or throughout the day or even, over very, very days, right? Various days. As long as you're consuming a diverse, plant-based diet, then you're good. You're getting everything you need.
Because we've all taken T. Colin Campbell's nutrition course, and he does say that over the course of the day, you fill in the protein. So that meat, for example, is considered a high quality or whey high quality protein, but that's not necessarily what we want. Right. The word high quality is deceiving, and that it might be unhealthy for us.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that needs to, like, high quality, you have to like dial in that a little bit more. Like, what does that really mean?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so and I think it goes full circle back to, where we started the conversation is like, okay, how is that being produced? Where is it coming from? Because, even every rice protein or every pea protein on the planet, it's not apples to apples, right? I mean, stuff can be higher in heavy metals and other, it could be
Right.
farmed with
Through its
pesticides and other
processing.
stuff. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
That you wouldn't want to consume either.
So we know that every single whole plant is a complete protein, like a pea or an apple, that it has right? It's because it's alive. And that's what I think people miss. And once we start to, like, for example, brown rice is it's gone through a process, right? It's not when it's its original form, it's a whole protein. So that brings me back to the processing question. So we know whey is like highly, highly processed. So there's a lot of whole foods that you eat from the ground. But in our really busy lives with 7.7 of us running around, we need some convenience and we need some access, and athletes get tired of chewing, quite frankly. This is literally a problem. Do feel so sorry for us, but you need something that goes in quicker and easier, and that's where what you do comes in. So the process that sprouted brown rice protein and pea protein go through to get to its eventual Lyfe Fuel package and the whey, what's the difference that makes it better than highly processed whey?
Yeah, so we don't use, the easiest thing, we're not using chemical solvents to go through that processing, right? So you're starting with organic whole food matter. It goes through a natural, like a drying process or spray drying, which is completely, chemical free. So you're preserving as much of that natural whole food source as possible, but also concentrating it for the key either vitamins or minerals or proteins that you're trying to get out of it. Okay. And so as minimally processed as possible, but because it's, freeze dried on site, it's actually, you're maintaining the nutritional density of that whole food, which is lost a lot of times when foods travel great distances. Also, depending on the quality of the soil, we're not getting all the key vitamins and minerals all the time from the diet alone. And that's really our flagship product, the Essential Shake. That's really what we looked at. It's like, how do we provide a convenient fuel source that's going to give you adequate amounts of the key vitamins and minerals that you're typically not getting from diet alone. So vitamin D, K2, which is a big one that nobody is talking about. B12, obviously, if you are vegan, super essential. You're going to have to supplement with it. Magnesium, iodine, right? And so the statistics around that on micronutrient inadequacies throughout the diet are pretty staggering. There's depending on what specific vitamin and mineral we're talking about, anywhere from 60% up to upwards of 90% of Americans are not getting enough, and that's not even talking about what's optimal. And so that's really what we try to do as a company, is provide optimal levels of nutrition, not just enough to prevent disease from happening, but really to make you feel good and thrive.
What's the importance of K2?
So K2 helps to, so it can shuttle, it basically shuttles calcium where it needs to go in the body, right? So K2 can help shuttle calcium into the bones. It can take it out of the arteries. So those are probably two of the biggest benefits
That's
of
a really important
K2.
reason.
And so unless you're eating a ton of fermented foods or grass-fed, like dairy would be another place where you would get it from. That's really the only place to get K2. And so because of our diet's changed so much, and it's you don't want to eat dairy just to get K2, right? Because there's too many other
downsides.
Yeah, exactly. So it's either, fuel up on fermented foods, or you're going to have to supplement with it to get it
Right.
into
I thought
your
green
diet.
leafies. Am I wrong?
Green
Yeah.
leafies as
Kale?
well. Yeah. Yep.
That's what I actually thought. They named it K2 after kale. I guess.
That reminds me, though, I've got to say, our lovely, wonderful Dr. Mills is talking about his quote of eating dairy for calcium or K2 or vitamin D, right, is like smoking a cigarette for its oxygen content, right? It just completely fails the risk-reward situation, like by a long shot.
You mentioned grass-fed, and you have chosen to eat grass-fed beef, but And you also mentioned it's important to know how your food is raised.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk to us about why you eat grass-fed beef or meat as opposed to other kinds of meat, and why you eat grass-fed at all?
Yeah, so I mean, I've dabbled in like going strictly plant-based, veganism. I've gone the place where it seems to work best for me is probably about 90-10, 95-5, whatever you want to call it, where there's still some meat left in my diet, and it's largely due to my wife also, who's done a lot of the cooking and stuff, and she's going through some additional challenges where some of the physicians that she's spoken to for autoimmune purposes is trying to focus on like the nutrient density. And so basically through grass-fed meat or beef, you're going to get a higher nutrient density without a lot of the antibiotics and hormones and the unnatural diet that you would typically get from commercialized beef production. And so that's kind of where I landed with, again, it's looking at how you, not only what you eat, like you are what you eat, right? But you are what you eat also. So if you do choose to consume any of those foods, it's very prudent that you understand how they're being raised, how they're being treated, because you don't want, again, all the downstream effects that come with animal meats that have been, if you drive up the 5 freeway, you can see how they're raised versus see them in their natural environment, in green pastures. It's a very different nutrient density fuel source than what you're typically getting.
I wanted to bring, correct me if I'm wrong, you focus more on grass finished.
Yes.
Than grass-fed.
Correct.
Okay, and I think that's a really, really important point.
Right.
And
Can we talk about it? Yeah, talk about the difference.
I want to tell you what I learned, and then you can, since I don't eat it, I probably maybe don't know what I'm talking about, but I learned from a truth tour that Switch for Good did in Boulder, Colorado, from a lady that came that was so wonderful and was sharing with me the difference, which I'd never heard of. So I did maybe a year and a half ago, a cow rescue from a small grass-fed farm, about 30 cows in Pennsylvania, and had an hour-long conversation with the farmer, learning all sorts of aspects. And this was grass-fed, right? So he said, Dotsie, every cow that is grass-fed, I'm doing air quotes right now, goes to a feedlot to get fattened up anywhere for about 3 to 6 months of their life following.
Well, where they eat
soy and corn and all the things that people that are eating grass-fed don't think they're eating. And so she taught me about grass-finished, right? Which is what it sounds like, that they never go to a feedlot, right?
Exactly.
It's from the grass to, not a good place for them anyway. So that is a distinct difference. And I would say, 99.9% of people out there, they're like, oh, I'm eating grass-fed, would never assume that their cattle is actually going to a feedlot to get fattened up as fast as possible, right, to make the most money for the yield of the farmer. That's kind of why they're in the business in the first place, to make a living. So, am I correct? Is it,
again,
what's
I
the
think
difference?
it's, sales and marketing, right? And it's now that grass-fed's in vogue or whatever, everybody can throw a label on it or whatever, and as long as it was grass-fed for a certain percentage of the lifespan, they don't know about the end point, which is so critical as well, right? And so if you fatten it up through the unnatural diet at the end, now you're changing the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, which is why you would eat grass-fed, grass-finished to begin with. Now you're, completely altering what that, again, fuel source, food source is supposed to be. You're eating it. The reason why you're paying more for grass-fed, grass-finished, the reason why you would even consume it in the first place is because it has a different nutritional profile than your average non-grass-fed beef or whatever that might be.
So can we get more specific about what
she likes
are
to
the?
just
Yes, I do.
Right?
Just because I think our audience wants to know.
Don't be fluffy around her, okay?
When you say the nutrients that you're looking for in meat, what are you looking for? And it might be specifically for the autoimmune disease that you're talking about. If you can be as
that's really interesting,
frank as possible, we would appreciate it, but we understand. And what's the difference between what you get in a grass-finished animal and an animal that's lived its life in a feedlot? Like, is there, if you looked at the
Yeah, it's mostly, I think
nutrients.
it's mostly the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. So in a standard American diet, we've consumed, the ratio of omega-3s to omega-6s is completely out of whack. We consume way more omega-6s. And even in a vegan diet, if you're not a whole food plant-based diet, that can be the case,
Yeah, if you
right?
have a junk food
just because
vegan.
you throw the word vegan on it doesn't make it, the healthiest diet on the planet, right? You still have to focus on what you're eating. If you're eating everything out of a package, then there's a problem with that. So largely omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. Now, can you get them other places? Absolutely, you can, right?
I've read on your site, actually, you blogged about the benefits of getting it from algae.
Yeah, exactly. I think the question that I've kind of wrestled with is, a lot of people will kind of say, look backward, right? Look how we evolved. Did we evolve to meat or whatever? Did we not? Can we thrive on a totally plant-based vegan diet? And it's like, okay, well, if B12 is so critical to our brain and the way we think, like, how did we don't need any meat at all? Well, now we don't, right? Because we can supplement with it. But what happened when we did? Were we getting it through nori? But if you look at
it's a bacteria. We
Well,
were getting the soil.
We were getting it from, well, B12 is not a vitamin, it is a bacteria. And the only reason we get it from meat is because the cows have it in their gut from eating what they eat.
Right.
Dirt, which is partly dirt, just because they don't clean it, their food as avidly. So if we here in modern times didn't clean our vegetables as much, then we could get B12. Am I correct?
Theoretically, yeah. But then you also have to
it's
look
like
at the soil.
glyphosate and B12.
Right.
It's like, what do I do?
Yeah,
I
what
wash
soil?
it right,
Yeah.
which was the worst.
But then how much of that do we know, right? And like the soil that, where we are getting our green leafy vegetables, how much do we know about that? And like how much nutrient density? And that's really the biggest, I think, problem is the nutrient density, the quality of the soil. It's gone from, crop rotation to monoculture, crop farming, right? And so those challenges, I think, still exist. So whether it's more efficient through getting it, through vegetables, ideally, yes, that would be where we'd all, get it from. Is that always the case? The labs that my wife was indicating was, no, it's not, like trying to be 100% like plant-based. It just wasn't happening. So does that mean either we have to take more supplements or try to get it through a higher quality fuel source? That's kind of what we've had to experiment with, right? Because it's all about just feeling better and getting healthier. My wife's personal transformation and journey and trying to get, 100% plant-based, it would be amazing. And really, maybe that is, I think we always look backward to see where we came from, but looking forward, I think, is this, the next big step for humankind is, getting away from being so dependent on animal-based foods. I think that's an interesting question to ask, especially if we have to feed 10 billion people on the planet.
Yeah,
how are we going to do that?
it?
How are we going to do that? Algae, I think, is pretty interesting, through fermentation. There's a lot of, emerging technologies that can, help to solve that problem. The way our food production is right now is not the solution. Animal production for fuel sources, it's not sustainable. So
can we talk about algae? I know
absolutely.
people want, I don't really know. All I know is that, people that want to take omegas maybe should just take it from where the fish get it from, and that's so it's always the conversation. Mine are always, I haven't thought much about it. They're always really good in my blood work. So I was like, whatever it is that I'm getting in is working okay. But so algae from a perspective of omegas, but also algae from a perspective of being able to feed lots of people. Cause I have seen, are they like algae pools that these people these people they're farming algae? Right.
There's different ways. There's different ways. So there's like ocean-borne algae, or there's basically controlled tanks.
Right.
Where
That's
you're
what I've
producing the algae,
seen just recently.
And there's also the way that the certain components, whether it's the omega-3, or if you're trying to get protein from algae or fats from algae, I mean, it's a pretty complete food source. So now there's algae protein, there's algae lipid, there's obviously omega-3s, there's also astaxanthin, there's all these amazing benefits of algae. And it can be done indoors. It can be done, in these big pools outdoors. So,
And those aren't any worse than the ocean algae. That's what I'm trying to understand. When
it's
they
going to be
saw,
better, most likely, if it's indoor or in a
Oh,
controlled environment,
okay.
because, now the challenge with the oceans is all the heavy metals and the, runoff from the feedlots and everything else that is now
Yeah,
seeped into the
right.
ocean. So it's this whole chain reaction, interconnectedness of our, ecosystem that now the oceans are suffering because of it. And it's tough to get, clean fish, clean algae without a lot of those ocean-borne contaminants in them. There's like the red algae, which is very highly potent in astaxanthin, so it's one of the most potent antioxidants on the planet. There's a lot of really profound clinical studies that they're doing around that and the benefits of using that. So then, you have the different algae that they concentrate for DHA, which is super important for brain health and cognition and all that good stuff.
So you think algae is a good substitute for fish oil if people are looking for omega, more omega?
Yeah, I think it goes. I would say, the same logic kind of is applied, right? The same way that, trying to bypass, you don't have to go through the cow to get like protein, right? And so there's no sense in using whey protein. You have to go through the fish to get your omega-3s, right? Go straight to the source, and that's where, the algae is where you're going to get a clean source of EPA, DHA predominantly, without a lot of those ocean-borne contaminants, and depleting the ocean of fish just for, fish oils. So,
Yeah. So when you fill your plate with 98% whole foods from the earth, tree, ocean, what would a typical meal look like? I mean, I want to hear what you're eating.
That's a really good question. So I love avocados, love sweet potatoes. So a lot of times it'll just be kind of like a macro bowl with a lot of those like different root vegetables, obviously some healthy greens, broccolini. Love hummus. And so that'll be like a great topping. So a scoop of hummus, scoop of guac, and you just have like this whole diversity of like deliciousness. That's like go-to, and it's pretty simple, to do. It doesn't take a ton of time to cook or prepare. The hummus is like so versatile and only takes maybe 10-15 minutes. So that's like really a go-to staple. I eat that all the time.
Did you find your taste buds really woke up after you
Absolutely.
kind of left that NFL diet behind, or whatever you want to call it, the 240-pound diet, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know if I was tasting food at the time. It just, and it's everything is just so mass, and it's like I think my sweet preference has definitely declined, tremendously. I don't crave,
Me neither.
the sweets. I don't crave, and it's weird after you have been doing something for so long, you don't have the same cravings for those undesirable foods. And there's some interesting science I read around that too, where it's like the short chain fatty acids or whatever, and the signaling to the brain will adapt and change over time. So you have less desire to crave the junk foods that you did previously when your gut wasn't fully functioning the way it should. And so pretty enlightening stuff.
Neurotaste adaptation, which we learned from Chef AJ.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
I want to ask a question before we end this interview with you. You talked about habits, and I know that as you help people get healthier. What is your main philosophy of how to make changes in your life, especially with diet and lifestyle, which are the most difficult ones to make?
I think the main philosophy is just get started, just take one step at a time. And there's a good analogy my buddy was telling me about. He recently got asked to speak back at college, and he said, speaking to a group of seniors who are ready to go out in the world and make that transition away from being an athlete. He said, look, we used to, run the stadium, how many ever steps or whatever, and, didn't matter, how you finish, right? All that matters is you got started and you figure out a way to get there,
get to
right?
the finish line.
And that's, it's
find your
true
way.
for life or anything, new habit or behavior that you want to develop. It's not like a linear pathway to getting there. You're going to get tossed around, you're going to get beat up a little bit, but that shouldn't deter you from waking up the next day and, trying again. And if you can hold on to like one little thing that you did better than the day before, then that's progress. And that's all you can hope for when you set out to achieve anything great or anything new, is to just keep trying, just keep showing up, and just, keep taking the next step. That's all you can really do.
I love athlete comparisons.
Yeah.
It's so perfect. It's so true.
Yeah.
One little thing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Yeah.
guys.
Really
It's been super
appreciate you
fun.
being on
Yeah.
the podcast.
Tell
Thank you
everyone
for
where to
having
find
me.
you before we go.
So you can find Lyfe Fuel, lyfefuel.com. That's Lyfe with a Y, Lyfe, Fuel.com. Also on social media at Lyfe Fuel, Lyfe, Fuel.com. I'm not a huge social media person, but
I hear you.
C Manderino, Manderino.
Okay, and that's like Instagram, Facebook.
Yeah,
Twitter, C.
Instagram.
Manderino.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is Facebook
right.
still around?
I don't know. I think so. That's what they say anyway.
Great.
Awesome.
Very
Thank
cool.
you so much for having me. This is great.
Thanks.
Cool.
So thank you so much for tuning in today. If we helped you in any way, then click the subscribe button and let's keep hanging out together. We have so much more to share with you.
And if you need more information on actually making the switch for good, please visit us at switchforgood.org for loads of info. And you can subscribe to our mailing list where you will receive all sorts of super cool gifts, discount codes to our very fave dairy-free products, and a lifetime of powerful health tips.
So join us on the journey to switch for good. This is the future.